worldwide COVID-19 pandemic, there had been a rise in rates of domestic and intimate partner violence, which includes data of how frequently it was reported and the severity of the cases. In March 2020 in Canada, when the lockdowns began, there had been many resources and supports that were meant to help abuse victims and their families that had been reduced.
The one who runs barefoot, cursing sharp stones. I am my mother.
Yet, there still remained a targeted population of women who had not only had to endure domestic and intimate partner violence throughout the pandemic, but who have also been affected and targeted since the beginning of Canada's history. The epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada relates to violence committed against Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, transgender, and gender-diverse people. In referring to Indigenous women throughout the video, I am also including other members of the Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual community.
We are a mother, savage daughters who wants to run barefoot, cursing sharp stones. We are a mother, savage daughters who will not cut our hair. We will not lower our voice. We are a mother, savage daughters who wants to run barefoot, cursing sharp stones. We've been cursing sharp stones. We will not lower our voice.
Spread awareness, let's bring our sisters home. Spread awareness, let's bring our sisters home. Spread awareness, let's bring our sisters home. Screaming MMIW till they bring our sisters home.
May 5th, the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Not everyone gets to pass peacefully. Red is a representation for those who are troubled in the spirit world, finding their way back.
Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me.
It's important to consider that statistics that have been collected are based on women who have reported their assault to police, which, as a result from intergenerational trauma and distress, many cases go unreported. Violence against Indigenous women occurs all throughout Canada, affecting Indigenous women, which includes 64% of First Nations, 65% Métis, and 45% of Inuit women. However, especially in Inuit communities, violent victimization is seen as a familiar part of their intimate relationship dynamic. Unfortunately, mental health support is limited or unavailable in many Indigenous communities. Therefore, many Indigenous women commit suicide since they are unable to get the treatment they need.
Good evening and welcome to 16 by 9, The Bigger Picture. Imagine living in third world conditions with a soaring crime rate and half your neighbors addicted to drugs. Incredibly, it's happening right in our own backyard. Tonight, a 16 by 9 exclusive. Our Sean Mallon brings you the shocking story.
And managed in some places to choke off supply to a trickle, sending prices skyrocketing.
We heard $400, but you're hearing up to $1,200 or $1,600 for one
Oxycontin.
It's kind of a funny way of measuring success, though, I guess.
It's a terrible way to measure success, but it is something.
So, mix in poor people addicted to expensive drugs, and the result is inevitably crime. Chief Mamakwa says his community has been hit with a rash of break-ins and thefts.
Does anyone in Ottawa know this is going on and taking an interest in this?
I'm sure somebody does down there. I'm not sure if they care, to tell you the truth.
You have to change the concept of where you're coming from.
At the KI First Nation, they're not waiting for help from Ottawa. They set up their own detox center, funded from their own limited resources.
It's our community problem, and as a community, I think we should deal with it.
A half dozen people go through every month. It's cold turkey withdrawal, with some counseling mixed in with traditional healing methods.
Well, my babies grew up half of the time with me being high.
Melanie Beardy has 4 children, aged 1 to 13. She's been using for 5 years and says her 2 youngest have never seen her sober.
All my income would go to that. And what I was depending on my family to feed my kids.
She's here to change that, but kicking an addiction to OxyContin is no easy matter.
I'm still thinking, what's one more line, right? One more, how would it feel?
So now you're just about ready to graduate from here. Think you're going to make it? Think you're going to be able to stay off this stuff?
You know, honestly, I believe I can do it.
Entire communities in the frozen north where children are raised in filth and residents live without hope. Here again is our Sean Mallon with a first-hand look at one of the worst places to live in Canada.
It's Fort Hope, a First Nation in northwestern Ontario where the living conditions are third world. I first visited here in 1989, and this is part of the story I told back then. On the shores of Lake Yabmut, you can see Canadian landscapes of exquisite beauty. You can also see diapered children playing in a filthy ditch. And you can see the home of Zacharias and Charlotte Misitiwajasik, a tiny bungalow where 16 people live. It's hard to believe that people live in a place like that in a country as rich as Canada. But when I returned to Fort Hope in 2011, 2 decades later, I found that if anything, things are worse.
How come you got the tarp over there?
This is Louis Sugarhead, and this is where his family lives, all 10 of them.
The door is not 100%, so it's really...
I can see right inside.
Despite being one of the lucky few in the community with a job, this is the best home Sugarhead can afford. With all those mouths to feed and a chronic housing shortage, this is as good as it gets.
So what's it like living with all those people in this little house?
It's pretty stressful at times, especially when you have kids crying all at once.
Only a thin layer of plastic separates the family from the brutal cold outside, and the inside is filthy, with mold, missing walls, and broken windows.
Falling apart, eh?
Not a good way to raise kids?
I guess, in a way, it's not really a good thing for them.
The one sign of hope for this community in 1989 was the bright new school and the promise of something better for the children. Today, the school is still there, but listen to the update from band manager Andrew Yesno.
The school was set on fire in the fall.
Even your school was set on fire?
Yeah.
That was when Fort Hope hit bottom. A wave of arsons ripped through the community. 12 buildings torched. The old band office was hit. And at this home, the residents barely escaped with their lives.
This house was occupied by one of the local ministers. He got up in the middle of the night to make some tea. He smelled something. He opened up the room door and the fire burst up in front of him.
That was probably the final straw.
What his officers deal with here is hard to believe.
You quoted a number of 500 violent crime incidents. In what year was that?
That was in 2008 and 2009, 2010.
Over those 3 years?
No, per year.
Per year?
Yeah.
500 in a community of what, 2,700?
2,700.
500 violent crimes a year?
Yeah.
Rampant alcoholism and gas sniffing make Pikangikum a tough place to raise kids. The vice principal of the local school, Barry Owen, worries about the children, the ones he teaches, and the 6 of his own.
So always be aware, 24/7. You have to see it every day.
Yeah. Keep a close eye on your kids?
Yeah.
In the last decade, Pikangikum became known for its high rate of youth suicide. In 2009, 14 killed themselves, a rate more than 30 times higher than the national average.
Some of my former students, 2 of them, took a toll on me when I heard it.
Principal Joanne Donnelly gave me a tour of the school. With all the problems in the community, it's not surprising that only about half the 800 school-aged kids attend class on most days.
We have kids who call and say that they can't come to school because they have to watch the house because they're afraid that they'll be broken into by the gas snippers in town.
For those who do show up, the facilities are woefully inadequate.
It's kind of appalling. It's embarrassing.
The old school burned down in 2007, and there's no sign Ottawa is ready to build a new one, leaving the children in cold, rickety portables that were supposed to be temporary.
They've all got very, very poor insulation in it, so it's like every other day we've got frozen pipes or furnace is not working. Like this one here, the pipes have burst in there like 4 times in the last month.
No gym, no library, no cafeteria. Even the bare necessities are missing.
What do you do about this?
You build a school. You need a school,
I guess.
But perhaps most appalling is the building specially designed for special needs kids. It's been closed since November because of a fuel spill.
The kids that are supposed to be in here, like we have kids who are blind, who are kids who are globally delayed, who are in wheelchairs or anything else, and they can't come to school.
Red dresses blowing in the wind at this vigil in Chelsea, Quebec are a sad reminder of Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women. Vigils around the country Monday are honoring these women's lives.
We're letting the families know that they're not alone.
In Alberta, Natawawaki English organized a march in honor of her daughters, one of them brutally murdered in 2015.
Joey's body was dismembered and was spread around Calgary, Alberta, Crescent High Parks, and the landfills. To this day, Joey's limbs still sit in the landfills, and only her torso and head came home.
For the last 4 years, English has walked this nearly 200-kilometer stretch of highway from her First Nation to this vigil in Calgary.
Every year it grows exponentially.
Fighting for their cause since 2005, the Indigenous women behind Sisters in Spirit hope public interest in reconciliation and observation of last week's Truth and Reconciliation holiday will mean more visibility and more support for the calls to action from the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was notably absent last Thursday, caught vacationing in Tofino instead of participating in any of the Truth and Reconciliation Day events.
Whether he shows up to these or not, we have the support of Canada. We have support of other Canadians that are allies to us.
We're the daring ones to take that step ahead and do something about it.
Women.
After the campaign called the Sisters in Spirits in 2010 by the Native Women's Association of Canada, they released statistics of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The government began a national inquiry to investigate, to estimating there being 1,200 women from 1980s to 2010 that had been murdered or missing. When the RCMP analyzed this information, they also took into consideration the unsolved cases or cases where the assaulter was not charged. Rates of intimate partner violence could be higher in rural and remote communities as opposed to larger cities, due to lack of providers who help with safety planning, women's shelters, housing for women who are fleeing abuse, and mental health support.
Unfortunately, I know about violence.
Pamela Beebe is an educator at the University of Calgary. She's also a First Nations woman and a mother of a young daughter. Every day, she says, she feels how vulnerable they are.
I've been at bus stops here in Calgary, just even recent in the last few years, and been bothered by men. A man would pull up and open his door, or will be like I'll be scared walking home.
6 months ago, she says she felt hopeful that 231 recommendations put forward by the inquiry into Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls would lead to something that would help people like her and her daughter feel safe. Right now, though, there is only disappointment.
There's nothing big. There's no big thing that they're doing to keep women and girls safe.
Pauline Muskego's family participated in the inquiry. Her daughter, Delene Bossy, was murdered in 2004. The man responsible becomes eligible for parole in just a few years. There is little time to waste.
Now it's time for everyone to act on these recommendations from all levels of government.
I'm here in Winnipeg to meet with the volunteer team Drag the Red. They've been dredging the Red River in Winnipeg for 2 seasons, searching for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I'm here to see what they find.
The body of a 15-year-old First Nations girl named Tina Fontaine was pulled from the Red River in Manitoba's capital, Winnipeg, wrapped in plastic in 2014. Fontaine had been missing for 10 days and was sexually exploited before her death. Police found her body by accident. They were looking for a man who was seen struggling in the river. A group of friends formed Drag the Red to look for more bodies after Fontaine was found.
In Indigenous culture, women are considered as life givers, caretakers, and responsible for early socialization of children. They were also honored for their wisdom and vision. However, men and women are equally in power. Men and women within Indigenous communities are taught to respect, honor, and care for one another. Women are a part of the culture's history, sharing legends such as Nakomi to the Ojibwe people, referencing the earth to be a woman and a mother to her people. She was described to have hair of sweetgrass, which is braided and used in ceremonies. The Sioux and Dakota people in Manitoba tell stories about the white buffalo calf woman. The woman in the legend was the one who brought the pipe that is used to reach the Creator to her people. Women were important leaders in their communities. However, the Patriarchal Indian Act of 1876 had discriminatory laws prohibiting women from having any position of power. These policies were only removed from the Indian Act in 2019. The introduction of the Confederation of the residential schools made victimization of Aboriginal women even worse. Many were never taught parental roles and how to properly care for children, since these schools held very little emotional regard toward their students. Thus, many traditions, practices, and stories have been lost, and many Indigenous people are unfamiliar with their culture. In 2016, only 1 in 6 adults in Canada were able to speak an Indigenous language fluently. However, there's a pattern of discriminatory conditioning that has happened for many years to view Indigenous people as those who are of less value than their white-skinned counterparts. In older versions of history books, they refer to Indigenous women as being frail and treated poorly by Indigenous men. This has become a symbol in society today of how Indigenous women are portrayed and could be viewed as a way of encouraging physical, psychological, and sexual violence toward them. In the past, European men would fantasize about the mythical Indian princess who was willing to leave her community and convert to Christianity. Indigenous people's rights are often violated, such as the right to culture, the right to health, the right to security, and the right to justice.
Most Canadians think that Justin Trudeau is making an effort. I gather you don't feel what he's doing is worthwhile.
Well, have you seen how much teenagers are going missing in Thunder Bay? You know, there's white supremacy, obviously. You know, that's what's going on. You know, that young boy. Yeah.
How can he be blamed for that? I mean, you don't think that anything he's doing is helping the situation? Is he an improvement over Stephen Harper? I mean, what talk about his record? Is it?
Excuse me, did I just hear you correctly? How can he be blamed for that?
No.
Excuse me.
Excuse me.
Don't speak to us that way.
Stop right now. You do not speak to us that way. We are human beings. And the way that you're speaking to us
is not acceptable. No, stop it. Stop it right now.
We don't want you here. Can you please leave?
Step out. Step out. Then I don't want to hear from you.
You have no right.
You don't speak to us like that.
Very simple question. Can I have an answer?
And this is the problem, the way you communicate.
I'm not insinuating anything. I'm looking for information.
I'm not going to argue.
Dante, my name is Tala Tatusis. Tawalinis yung got to ya, Tagueno Nehia was square Sigasoyan, Sturgeon Lake Otsinia, Treaty 6. The first time that I was called a squaw was when I was partying. I was in my early 20s. I was hooking up with a guy, or gonna hook up with a guy. I was thinking about it. I was talking to him, flirting, and I remember I decided I just wanted to go home. And I told him I didn't want to fool around anymore. We were just kissing, and he got angry, and he called me a dumb squaw.
My name is Manado Gabwe Indigenous. My colonial given name, Valerie Gwen Kinistino. I hail from Ochapowace First Nation, Treaty 4 territory. The first time I was called a squaw was in the playground of school that I went to, elementary school, and it kind of hit hard and nasty because it created a lot of conflict, and I really didn't know what the heck that was. Like, you're a little dirty Indian, little squaw, get out of here.
Tansei, Erica Violet Lee, Nitsigasan, Misasquatominik, Egua PSO, Wasis Nitotsen. My name is Erica Violet Lee, and I am from Westside, Saskatoon. I'm Nehio. The first time that I was called the S word, I was 11 years old and in grade 5 or 6, I think. And it was here in Saskatoon. I transferred to a school that was predominantly white teachers and white students. And I remember playing on the playground with my friends at recess and hearing that name yelled out to me. And at the time I didn't realize the history of it, but I did know that it was something derogatory. I knew that it was something to be ashamed of, and it stopped me in my tracks even at age 11.
Indigenous women are heavily sexualized in the way they are portrayed in society through stereotypical racist views that only view those women as prostitutes, homeless, or a drug addict. Many cases go unreported or underreported because the media has normalized victimization or blame toward Indigenous women. In 1869, the Canadian government proceeded with enfranchisement, where Indigenous people would lose their status as Indians and be treated like any other Canadian citizen. This especially impacted Indigenous women because enfranchisement forced women to be subjected to males. This was especially seen in the Métis, otherwise referred to then as half-bloods. European men would marry Indigenous women, and she would immediately lose her status upon marriage. This was enforced under the Indian Act by Indian agents. The government only recognized someone as Indigenous if the individual were a man, married to an Indigenous man, or was a child of one. If an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she was removed from the community and her status taken away immediately. This could be why in the 1950s, the Juvenile Delinquents Act and Training School Act was established, which forced Indigenous women to be trained to obey European patriarchal roles, and if they were defiant, they would be punished. Indigenous women, girls, and members of 2SLGBTQIA are targeted by partners, family members, acquaintances, and serial killers. Indigenous females are 7 times more likely to be targeted by a serial killer, such as Robert Pickton or Robert Hansen.
A native reservation without clean water in 2021.
Remember me, download, hand in hand, you and me.
Please don't talk to me about decolonization when you still speaking in the colonizer's language. See you genocide us, then you colonize us. See you sterilize us, and now you fetishize us. See you stigmatize us, then
The aim is to give faces and names to these women and girls, turning them from mere cases to individual lives, like Amber Elisa Tukaro, mother of an infant, missing 5 years ago, age 20. Her remains found 2 years later.
Indigenous people living in housing in need of major repairs was almost 3 times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. Mary Burton from Fearless R2W says Winnipeg's North End is the perfect example of inadequate housing.
They face barriers in the judicial system, including isolation from victim services, unable to accommodate language barriers, and stigmatized views of how Indigenous women act, or are completely ignored in the media. 83% of Indigenous women who saw or heard any one of their parents, step-parents, guardians beat one another became more prone to violent victimization within their lifetime. Indigenous girls were 6 times more likely to be under the legal responsibility of the Canadian government than non-Indigenous. Out of those Indigenous girls, 81% were subjected to violence. Women had their children taken away from them due to the Confederation of Residential Schools for Aboriginal Children from the ages of 4 to 16. These children would either return home 8 to 10 years later or not at all. Students were taught to disregard everything Indigenous. Several generations of children and families had to go through emotional, physical, and sexual abuse because of these schools. This could be why so many struggle with their family responsibilities by knowing how to care for their offspring and attempt to preserve the cultural practices and beliefs. These women and men that were made to live in residential schools never developed parenting skills because they were not raised by their own parents and often suffered abuse or lack of attention from the schools. Not only has parenting styles and attachments been lost due to the repercussions of the residential schooling system, but Indigenous women also have higher rates of financial instability. This could be attributed to 72% of Indigenous women who live in poverty that have lower levels of education, scarce employment opportunities, and health ailments. Throughout time, Indigenous women and girls hold very little trust toward the criminal justice system and police. Therefore, many crimes of violence go unreported. It is estimated that 6 out of 10 incidents of violence toward Indigenous people go unreported. Alarmingly, Indigenous women incarceration rates had increased by 90% in the last decade. Indigenous women are over-incarcerated and unprotected as victims of violent crimes. However, with violent attacks against Indigenous women, it may seem like no surprise that their lives would remain hostile and dangerous. Methods of violence that are mostly used against Indigenous women include physical beatings, being stabbed, being shot, or strangled, suffocated, or drowned. In consideration to the government and law enforcement for attempting to improve the epidemic of murdered, missing Indigenous women, it is important to note that powerful, passionate, and positive movement that is taking place to bring awareness to this issue and bring back aspects of Indigenous culture that were lost.
Raised voices raise strong women. Try on anything.
Across many social media platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, many Indigenous people have been able to share their stories, culture, and knowledge from all over Canada. This seems promising in consideration that Indigenous youth are the fastest growing population despite other ethnicities, which allows opportunities to spread awareness, expose biases and prejudices, and educate the younger generations. To conclude, murdered, missing Indigenous women has been an epidemic that's been minimized or ignored for generations. Canada and the Indigenous people have shared a dark and painful history that has created a cycle of violence that targets Indigenous women and children. Violent victimization and marginalization of Indigenous people from supports has shown to be an indicator and factor of violence against Indigenous women and children. Other factors that could be affecting the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is the roles and symbolism of Indigenous women in both Western and Aboriginal perspectives. Also enfranchisement, assimilation of the targeted demographic, impacts of trauma stemming from residential schooling, criminal justice, and incarceration rates. However, it's crucial to consider ways to reconcile the past in order to preserve the cultural principles and practices that could one day be lost if we don't start now. Indigenous women are responsible for passing on this information to the younger population, but cannot do so effectively if we don't approach the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women with unity and determination. These are motivators for change, with the opportunity to heal and grow while honoring each other as a human being with equal value, worth, and the right to justice.
I know in Nunavut we need a lot of things. How come we do this when we don't know what it could bring? Rich men want honey and buy our land. They're the ones with money who know they can. We don't even have enough money to compete. Barely have enough food to eat. I'll fight for my land and I won't back down. We can't take it back next time around. They make money off of our needs. Our culture is the one that bleeds. The animals won't recover from the mine. Our land will become the scene of a crime. Then we're left with nothing left to die. So here I am asking you why. Fight for the rights of our people. Fight for the rights of our people. For our people, for our future people. Fight for the rights of our people. Fight for the rights of our people. For our people, for our future people. our people.